Welcome, everyone, to Easy History Podcast. It's time for another deep dive, and today we're going back to 17th century England.
Yeah.
Specifically, the English Civil War. Now, I know what you're thinking, another civil war, but this one, trust me, it's a wild ride.
Right.
You've got a nation, speaks the same language, shares traditions, and bam, they're at each other's throats.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? How does this happen? What pushes people to that point?
Exactly. And that's what we're going to try to unpack today.
Okay.
So strap in, because we're starting right in the thick of it. January 30th, 1649.
Oh.
London.
Oh.
Whitehall. King Charles I is about to be executed.
Publicly.
Publicly.
Wow.
Now imagine the scene. A scaffold. The king. He gives this final speech, and get this, he says, liberty's about being governed, not about having a say in the government.
That's interesting. So he's basically saying, just trust me to do what's best for you.
Pretty much. But clearly, a lot of his subjects weren't buying it.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the whole point, right? This clash of ideas about what freedom actually means.
Right. And then, boom, the executioner, masked. A single blow. Witnesses said the crowd let out this wave of lament, this sound of pure sorrow. Never wanted to hear it again.
Heavy stuff. I mean, to see your king, your sovereign, executed like that.
And then, to really drive the point home, they showed the king's head to everyone.
Oh, wow. A powerful image, to say the least. It's like they're saying, look, the monarchy, it's over. We're in charge now.
Exactly. Dismantling the whole idea of a divinely appointed king. The body, of course, they embalmed it, buried it at Windsor Castle. But the point is, Charles I was the first European king executed after a trial.
A legal trial.
A legal trial.
For high treason, that's a huge deal. A king held accountable by the law, by his own people.
That sends shockwaves.
Right.
Through all the monarchies in Europe.
Absolutely. You can't just execute a king.
Well, clearly they did, but it didn't come out of nowhere.
Right, right.
This was the climax of a 6-year civil war.
Yeah.
And just a dozen years before, England thought it was peaceful.
Peaceful, prosperous. They were having these elaborate parties, these masques with music, dancing. They'd build these huge sets, even at court.
Right. And remember, this is while the rest of Europe is engulfed in the 30 Years' War.
The brutal war.
Brutal. And in 1637, the lawyers in London, they put on this masque all about the triumph of peace. Ironic, right?
Yeah, a little bit. It's like they were trying to convince themselves that everything was fine, while the rest of Europe was falling apart.
And Charles himself, in that same year, told his German nephews, remember, they came from lands ravaged by war. He told them he was the happiest king in Christendom.
Oh, wow.
Talk about being out of touch.
Yeah, it's almost like he was living in a bubble. He was so isolated from what was really happening in his kingdom.
Right. Because this peace, it was an illusion. Discontent was bubbling under the surface, and Charles was completely clueless, thanks in part to the whole rigid structure of the royal court.
Right. I mean, these European courts back then, they were all about formality, hierarchy. And England, it might have been the most extreme.
Think about it. Noblemen serving the king at his table, on their knees.
That's humbling. That's not a setting that encourages open dialogue, you know?
And public interaction. Forget it. You had this thing, this ceremony, where the king would touch people suffering from scrofula. The king's evil, they called it.
Oh, yeah.
People thought he had healing powers. But to even get near him, you needed like 3 signed certificates.
So you're telling me there was this whole bureaucratic system just to get touched by the king?
Yeah. It was less about actually healing people, more about reinforcing the whole divine king image.
Makes sense.
So while Charles was in his bubble, the court itself became a target. It's a big shift from, say, Queen Elizabeth I. She was popular.
Oh, absolutely. She was a master at public image.
But then you have James I, Charles's dad. Different story.
Not as popular.
Not as popular. And then, of course, there's the Duke of Buckingham, James's favorite.
Oh, Buckingham. That was a whole other level of unpopularity.
Right. This guy had power, he sold titles, and he was super close to the king.
Super close. Their letters, let's just say they were intimate.
Yeah. And then you've got all these rumors swirling around, orgies, drunkenness.
Not exactly the image you want for your monarchy.
No. Charles was different. He was more austere, more, cold.
Yeah.
But he still relied on Buckingham. And when Buckingham was assassinated, the public rejoiced.
Celebrated. There were ballads about it, praising the assassin as a hero.
So the court's image tarnished.
Yeah.
And it just got worse from there. Then Charles marries Henrietta Maria, a French Catholic princess,
Oh boy, in Protestant England.
in Protestant England. And she liked to dance, to go to the theater, not exactly what the Puritans wanted to see.
Not at all.
So the perception out on the countryside was that the court was this foreign entity. It was wicked, wasteful, promiscuous.
And of course, philo-papist.
That one was a big one. And this brings us to religion. Because in the 17th century, religion was everything. It was the foundation of society.
Right. After the Reformation, England had its own church, the Anglican Church. The king was the head.
Right. But even though they rejected the Pope, they kept a lot of the Catholic structure.
Bishops, hierarchy, all that stuff.
And here's the thing. Literacy rates were going up in the 17th century. So more people could read, and that meant more people were reading the Bible.
And interpreting it in their own way.
Which is where the Puritans come in. They started as these small groups, people reading the Bible together.
But they wanted a pure form of Protestantism, simpler worship, no bishops.
They also rejected all the Catholic stuff in Anglican rituals, like the crucifix, the images.
Idolatry.
So on the one hand, you have these ideas that sound almost democratic, right?
Right.
People having a say in their church. But on the other hand, the Puritans were pretty extreme. Black clothes, no fun allowed, theaters closed.
They believed they were the elect, chosen by God. And sometimes they thought their enemies deserved to be wiped out.
It was complicated.
Definitely.
But the point is, Puritanism challenged authority. And this really worried people, like Thomas Hobbes.
Hobbes, he was a smart guy.
Yeah. He said that once the Bible was translated into English, people thought they could interpret it for themselves.
Which meant they didn't need the church to tell them what to believe. And if you could question the church, why not question the king?
Right. And Charles, he insisted everyone follow the Anglican Church, obey the bishops.
Big mistake.
Huge mistake. And then there were the bishops themselves. Everyone knew they weren't really independent. They were just doing what the king told them to do.
Puppets.
Even Elizabeth Tiny knew that was a problem.
It undermined their authority. If they're just the king's men, why should anyone listen to them?
Exactly. But Charles was determined to make the bishops powerful again. And he had just the man for the job. Archbishop William Laud.
Laud. Now there's a controversial figure.
Oh, yeah. Laud believed the monarchy and the church had to be saved together.
The throne and altar. Christian dissenters.
And he convinced Charles.
Not hard to do, apparently.
So, who was Laud? Well, he came from humble beginnings, became a scholar, but he was also known for being, well, let's just say difficult.
Irritable, intolerant, the kind of guy who always had to be right.
And he kept this diary filled with these strange dreams. He was worried about the queen, the Catholic queen.
Of course.
In one dream, the king wanted to marry a Protestant widow, but Laud couldn't find the marriage ceremony in the prayer book. It freaked him out.
Interesting. Even Laud, the king's man, had these anxieties about Catholicism. Shows you just how tense the religious atmosphere was.
Right. But publicly, Laud was all about enforcing the king's policies. Stained glass, organs, fancy robes for the priests, kneeling for communion, candles.
All that stuff that the Puritans hated.
He even called their practices, like bowing at the altar, monkey-like gestures.
Not exactly a recipe for peace and harmony.
No. And the result. The Puritans, they started fleeing to America. The Pilgrim Fathers.
They had enough.
Charles even thought about banning emigration. That's how many were leaving.
Wow.
But Puritanism didn't die out. It went underground. And guess what helped it spread?
The printing press.
The printing press. You had these pamphlets, these sermons, criticizing the king, defending the persecuted Protestants, and the state couldn't control it.
A whole new way to spread ideas, to mobilize people, and the government, they were playing catch-up.
And you have guys like William Prynne. He wrote this book attacking actresses, saying they were immoral. He even criticized Christmas and toasting.
Prynne was intense. He saw sin everywhere.
And his punishment. They fined him, put him in the pillory, cut off his ears. Then he kept writing, so they cut off what was left of his ears, branded him. But people sympathized with him. They saw him as a victim of tyranny.
The martyr.
So you have all this religious persecution, the Queen's Catholicism, and people started believing that the king was secretly Catholic too.
Even though he was a Protestant.
Even though he was a Protestant.
Yeah.
But his foreign policy, like allying with Catholic Spain, it didn't help.
No.
And the situation of Catholics was weird. You had laws against them, but a lot of nobles were Catholic. And there were even Catholic priests in England. And the Queen had Mass at court.
A very mixed message.
And the ordinary people, they heard about this and they were furious. They thought the king was betraying them.
Right.
And all the while, Laud was sending these reports back to the king, saying everyone was happy and loyal.
Talk about an echo chamber.
Charles was completely in the dark.
Living in a fantasy world.
And then there's the whole conflict with Parliament. In the 17th century, you have this idea of absolute monarchy gaining traction.
The king answers only to God.
Not to the people.
Yeah.
Not to Parliament.
Right.
But in medieval times, kings had to consult with assemblies, like Parliament, especially about money.
Because they couldn't just tax people without their consent.
But these 17th century kings, they hated that. They thought they were above all that.
Above the law.
James I, Charles's dad, he really pushed this divine right of kings thing. He said kings were like gods. They had absolute power.
He even wrote a book about it.
And Charles, he took it to heart. He tried to rule without Parliament altogether.
Not a good idea in England.
Not a good idea. Because Parliament in England, it had a lot of power, more than in other countries.
Magna Carta and all that.
Right. And Parliament had two houses, the Lords and the Commons. The Commons, they were the ones who really gave Charles trouble.
They represented the gentry, the merchants.
The money.
The money. They were the ones who controlled the purse strings. And they weren't afraid to use that power.
Right. And for the first time, you start seeing this organized opposition in Parliament.
MPs who consistently disagreed with the king, who weren't just going to rubber stamp whatever he wanted.
And in 1629, Charles had enough. He dissolved Parliament and ruled without it for 10 years.
The personal rule.
Or, as his critics called it, the 11 years tyranny. But even his own ministers were worried about how he was going to raise money without Parliament.
Because everyone knew you couldn't just tax people without their consent.
So Charles came up with these schemes, selling licenses, monopolies.
The soap monopoly was a disaster. Terrible soap, black market, spies everywhere.
People were miserable.
And they blamed the king.
And then there was ship money.
Ah, ship money.
This tax was usually just for coastal areas to pay for the Navy. But Charles decided to apply it to the whole country.
That didn't go over well.
No. People were like, no taxation without representation.
Or in this case, no taxation without Parliament.
Exactly. Even the Lords refused to pay. One guy actually got himself arrested just to challenge it in court.
He was making a statement.
And the judges, they were split. Some said the king could do whatever he wanted, rex lex.
The king is the law.
But others said no. Private property was sacred. You can't just tax people without their consent.
It was a fundamental clash over the limits of royal power.
And, some historians argue that this whole fight over ship money was actually the first bourgeois revolution.
Because it was all about protecting property rights against the king.
Right. So by this point, Charles is on a collision course with, everyone.
The nobles, the merchants, the common people.
But the thing that really set everything off was Scotland.
Ah, Scotland.
Now, Scotland was Calvinist. Their church was the Kirk. And they hated anything that even smelled Catholic.
Incense, images, you name it, they saw it as a threat to their faith.
And they were fiercely independent. They didn't want England telling them what to do, especially about religion.
Their fear of Catholicism was even stronger than in England. They called it the whore of Babylon.
But Charles and Laud, they wanted to force the Scottish Kirk to be more like the Anglican Church.
Another big mistake.
They tried to introduce the new English prayer book in Scotland in 1637.
And it backfired spectacularly.
Oh, yeah. Riots in Edinburgh. People were throwing stones at the bishop while he tried to conduct the service.
They weren't messing around.
The king's advisors in Scotland, they got scared and suspended the prayer book. But Charles was furious. He wanted to punish the rebels.
He just didn't get it.
No, he thought he could force them to obey. But the Scots, they had other ideas.
They were ready to fight for their faith.
They sent a petition to the king, asking him to back down. But he just ignored them.
He demanded complete submission.
So the Scots signed the National Covenant.
A bold move.
It was a promise to defend their kirk no matter what.
Even against the king.
And people across Scotland signed it. It was this huge display of unity and defiance.
It showed how serious they were.
The Scottish Archbishop, he fled to London, said everything he'd worked for was destroyed. And the King's Council in Scotland, they basically said, we can't control this.
They were losing control. Fast.
And news of all this spread to England, thanks to the printing press. People in England were reading about what was happening in Scotland.
And some of them were inspired by it.
Even Charles's court jester made fun of Laud, asking him who the real fool was now. He got fired for that.
He pushed his luck a bit too far.
And in Scotland, anyone who didn't sign the covenant was kicked out.
The Covenanters were serious about this.
But even some of them worried that things were getting out of control. They were afraid of a social revolution.
The lower class is rising up against the elites.
In July 1638, Charles finally declared war on Scotland. But it was really unpopular in England. People didn't want to fight the Scots.
Especially when there were bigger threats out there, like Spain.
And the Scots, they were smart. They appealed directly to the English people, trying to get them on their side.
Propaganda.
And Charles, he had no money for this war. He tried to borrow, but it wasn't enough.
He should have called Parliament.
He should have, but he didn't.
Stubborn.
He even tried to get a loan from the Pope. Can you believe that?
Desperate times.
Desperate times. He also seized money from merchants in London, which just made everyone even angrier.
Not the best way to make friends and influence people.
No. And raising an army was a nightmare. There were rumors that recruits were being sent to America as slaves.
That'll dampen enthusiasm for joining up.
Meanwhile, the Scots raised an army and invaded England. In August 1640, they crossed the border.
Talk about a humiliation for Charles.
Right. They even sent another petition to the king, and this time some English lords signed it too. They were worried about Strafford's idea of bringing an Irish army into England.
Strafford was a lightning rod for opposition.
And Charles, he didn't know what to do. He told Strafford to run, then said he'd be safe. It was a mess.
Indecisive.
And up in the north of England, where the Scots were, people actually sympathized with them.
Fellow Protestants, they saw the Scots as fighting for the same cause.
Charles had no money, no army, and now half of England was basically siding with the enemy.
He was in deep trouble.
He had to sign a treaty with the Scots, the humiliating one. They got to stay in England, and he had to pay for it.
Wow.
His only option left.
Parliament.
So he called another parliament.
The Long Parliament.
The Long Parliament. And the elections were, well, they were intense.
People knew this was a turning point.
Charles tried to get his supporters elected, but it didn't work.
The mood had shifted.
The court party in the Commons, they were wiped out. There were Puritan slogans everywhere, calling the king's men atheists and papists.
They weren't holding back.
And even poorer people, artisans, shopkeepers, they were voting. They weren't just following the local lords anymore.
It was a more democratic process.
One lord complained about people without shirts having the same vote as him.
He was not happy.
The Puritans were urging everyone to vote, saying it was God's will. And people thought this new parliament was going to change everything.
Millenarianism. They thought a new age was dawning.
But for most MPs, they just wanted Parliament to have more power, to protect their property, and to get rid of the Catholic-looking stuff in the church.
They weren't necessarily looking for a total revolution.
Right. So the Long Parliament meets in November 1640. Charles goes there, needs money for the war.
Begging bowl in hand.
Pretty much.
Yep.
But Parliament, they said, hold on, we have some things to discuss first.
Like your habit of taxing us without asking?
Right. Charles had lost control.
Completely.
And Parliament, they started acting like they were the real government. They gave orders to local officials. They abolished censorship of the press.
Things were moving fast.
And they started attacking the king and his ministers, especially Strafford.
Strafford was their main target.
And Laud, he had another bad dream. His portrait fell off the wall. He was worried.
He should have been.
They released Prynne from prison, and guess who they arrested in his place? Strafford.
Talk about poetic justice.
And then the son of one of the king's secretaries, he found some incriminating notes about Strafford's plan to use an Irish army and gave them to Parliament.
That sealed Strafford's fate.
Royal officials started fleeing the country. It was chaos.
It was a revolution.
Parliament, they started implementing Puritan policies. They arrested and executed Catholic priests, banned Sunday games, got rid of images in churches, banned kneeling during communion.
They were remaking England in their image.
And they impeached Laud and imprisoned him in the Tower.
So both Laud and Strafford were now behind bars.
Strafford's trial started in March 1641. It was a huge event. Everyone was watching.
It was the trial of the century.
They accused him of all sorts of things, but the main thing was that he wanted to use an Irish army to crush England.
Which terrified people.
It was a really emotional trial. People were shouting and screaming in the courtroom.
It was a powder keg.
Strafford defended himself well, But Parliament was determined to get rid of him. So they used this thing called a Bill of Attainder.
Which basically meant they could declare him guilty without a proper trial.
It bypassed the whole legal system.
Yeah.
And the Lords, they were nervous about it, but they passed it anyway.
They were afraid of Parliament.
Charles, he didn't want to sign the death warrant, but he was under so much pressure, he finally gave in and then immediately regretted it.
That was the beginning of the end for Charles.
2 days later, Strafford was executed. Laud, from prison, he said Strafford wasn't worth serving a king who wouldn't protect him.
He felt betrayed.
And it's like, at this point, the more Charles gives in, the worse it gets for him.
It's just like in the French Revolution.
But the thing is, some people in Parliament started getting worried. They thought the Puritans were going too far.
They were afraid of a real social revolution, one that would upend the whole order.
They were worried about their property, about their power.
Right.
And then there was the plague in London.
Oh, yeah.
People were terrified. Opposition leaders were getting death threats, plague-ridden rags sent to them.
Nasty.
Charles, he saw this division, this fear, and he tried to use it to his advantage. He warned that the common people might rise up, demand equality, destroy property.
Playing on their fears.
Right. And in January 1642, he tried to arrest 5 key MPs.
A bold move.
He went to Parliament with soldiers, but the MPs, they got away.
Someone tipped them off.
The Speaker of the House, he told Charles that he served Parliament, not the king.
A clear statement of defiance.
Charles, he fled London and went north, started raising an army. Parliament did the same.
It was war.
He tried to seize an arms depot in Hull, but it failed. And finally, in August 1642, he raised his standard at Nottingham. War was officially declared.
The nation was divided.
Brother against brother.
Families torn apart.
Parliament was split. About half the Commons and most of the Lords sided with Parliament. But a lot of them, especially the younger ones, supported the king.
Interesting. Maybe they saw the king's vision as more modern.
Maybe. And they were all terrified of what this war would unleash. One MP said he was worried about the rabble taking over.
Fear of anarchy was real.
In the end, Parliament won the war. But that social revolution, it didn't really happen.
Not in the way that some people had feared.
Laud was tried for treason in 1645. And guess who was the prosecutor? William Prynne.
Talk about revenge.
The evidence against Laud wasn't great, but Parliament used another Bill of Attainder to get rid of him. He was beheaded.
Just like Strafford.
And the groups that really wanted equality, like the Levelers, they were crushed by the Parliamentarian army.
The revolution had its limits.
So, the English Civil War, it's a story of how political, religious, and social tensions can explode. It's about power, about beliefs, about how a nation can tear itself apart.
And it shows how seemingly small things, like a king's personality or a new technology like the printing press, can have huge consequences.
It makes you think, doesn't it? About what we value, about how we balance power, about how we handle differences.
It's a story that still resonates today.
And for those of you who want to learn more, there's so much to discover. The English Civil War, it shaped democracy, it inspired philosophers like Hobbes and Locke, it changed the religious landscape of England.
It's a fascinating period.
So what are you waiting for? Dive in.